Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 25th of November of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk, of course, about the Kurakhove direction, because exactly from the territory of this direction we received the most important updates, and the most important updates are coming from the city of Kurakhove itself. As you can see, we have significant changes on the map. Let's compare the map between two dates. This is the situation by the end of the 24th of November, and this is the situation by the end of the 25th of November. The Russians, as you can see, managed to reach the middle part of the central part of Kurakhove, and the Russians continue advancing. Now the situation for the Ukrainians is very difficult, so let's discuss in details. Just yesterday we got the first reports that there were very heavy clashes in the vicinity of the school number 5. This is the school number 5. And we discussed the situation yesterday, and today by the end of the 25th of November we have the first video from the central part of Kurakhove itself. And in this video, first of all, we can see a smoke screen that was established by the Russians during their offensive operation, and we see a personnel carrier of the armored force of Russian Federation that was located on the corner of the building, and we can see the first Russian soldiers that abandoned the armored vehicle and began entering the building itself. So this is 100% proof that the Russians entered the central part not just with the use of the sabotage and reconnaissance group. The Russians managed to enter this territory with a regular army and armored vehicles, and the Russians began expanding their foothold exactly in this part. This is very difficult and very critical situation for the Ukrainians. This building, of course, was geolocated. This is exactly the building. This is exactly the corner where we saw the Russian fighting vehicle, and this is the corner where the Russian infantry entered inside of the building by the number of 22 on the Pokrovsk Avenue. So what is the current status and what exactly we should expect next from this direction? First of all, it's still unclear the status and the situation with those Ukrainians that are located in high-rise building area in the southern part of the city of Kurakhove. This part has the title of Yuzhny micro district, and we still don't know for sure what exactly is happening with the Ukrainians that are located in the southeastern farms of the city of Kurakhove. And of course, we still have no information about those Ukrainians that are currently located in this dense network of the fortification. So there are three positions that were still under Ukraine control when the Russians entered the most central part of the city itself. Another important thing that today, during the previous 24 hours, we have very important video from 0510 road that was published by the 33rd Mechanized Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine. In this video we can see how the Ukrainians were filming the Russians moving through the fields. We can see how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians everywhere along this line, and this video confirms Russian control over this street, over this road 05010, and one of the geolocations was spotted exactly in this line. So now let's discuss in details. First of all, the most critical situation came for those Ukrainians that are located in these three strongholds, because if the Russians continue advancing, and we understand that the Russians are going to continue advancing further in the western direction, and most likely from these positions the Russians most likely will try to move further in the southwestern directions towards this intersection of the three lines. So this is the target for the Russians, and if the Russians are able to take under control this part of Kurakhove, then most likely the Ukrainians that are currently located in these three strongholds will lose any possibilities for successful evacuation. Most likely their losses during the retreat process will come to 100%. Because when talking about these Ukrainians, they have just several roads for evacuation. The first road goes from this micro district usually in the western direction through this intersection of the three lines, and then further in the southwestern direction, northwestern directions towards the Kurakhove power plant. So this is the first road evacuation, and as for now I believe that Ukrainians have possibilities to use this road, but probably during the next 24 hours they will lose these possibilities, because this is exactly where the Russians are moving. The Russians, as you can see, are trying to outflank these Ukrainian positions. The next Ukrainian evacuation road goes also along the 0510 road to this intersection of the injections of the three lines, and then the evacuation road turns in the western directions towards this company stronghold. And as for the southern road evacuation, the Russians managed to reach the outskirts of this road, and most likely also during the upcoming night the Russians either are going to establish complete fire control over this territory, which will lead to complete losses of the armored forces of Ukraine, or the Russians will establish physical control, which will lead to the same story. And if the Russians are able to take under control this part, and if the Russians are able to cut this road physically, then the Ukrainians will have just one road for evacuation through the fields. But when talking about this line, obviously the Ukrainian losses would be up to 100% during evacuation process. So summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that most likely during the night between the 25th of November and the 26th of November, the Ukrainians that are currently located in this part of Kurakhove, in these fields and this dense network of the fortifications and strongholds, would be forced to fall back in the direction of the company strongholds to the southwest of Kurakhove itself. So most likely this is the scenario that we're going to see during the next 12 or 24 hours. So during the next night of Ukrainian time. Most likely the Russians will not dig in deeper in the northern part of the central Kurakhove, where we're talking about this attack. Of course, the Russians sooner or later will enter this territory, but most likely if the Russians enter this territory, they will try to enter completely empty buildings and empty fortifications. The main purpose and the main tactics that the Russians are using in this stage of the special military operation is outflanking. So as soon as the Russians reach this part, most likely they will continue moving further in the northwestern direction towards the power plant with the purpose to cut the Ukrainians in the central part. As soon as the Ukrainians realize that the Russians are about to finish the encirclement, most likely they will be forced to retreat along the Energetikov street in the direction of Kurakhove power plant. And this is basically the next defense belt. I'm not sure for how long the Ukrainians will be able to hold their positions, but this is going to be the next defense belt between the Kurakhove power plant company stronghold and the Uspenivka fortified area, where the Ukrainians will try to slow down the Russians a bit. I'm not sure that the Ukrainians are able to stop the Russians forever, but obviously 1 week maybe the Russians will be forced to spend to penetrate this defense belt. So this is the situation, the central part of Kurakhove and the territory and fields between the village of Dalny itself and the Kurakhove. Now let's talk about the Uspenivka fortified area. We continue receiving updates about critical situation for the armored forces of Ukraine in these three villages like Yelizavetovka, Ilinka and Romanovka. More and more sources reported that the Russians managed to establish complete control over every single village in this direction, and telling the truth, we have no doubts about this. The main thing is that Ukrainians were caught in cauldron in this area, exactly on the territory of Yelizavetovka, and today we got several posts and several reports from the 79th Air Mobile Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine. They reported that Ukrainians were encircled in this area, and during the night between the 24th and the 25th of November, with clashes, with heavy battles, the Ukrainians were breaking through the encirclement in the direction of the villages of Veselый Gai and in the direction of the village by the name of Ganovka. The Ukrainians managed to break through the encirclement, but the sources from the 79th Brigade reported that Ukrainians had very heavy and very difficult losses. So most likely tomorrow the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation will report about control over these three settlements, and then the battle for Zelený Gai and the village of Ganovka begins. This is the two final villages before the battle for the Uspenivka's fortified area. But the sources are saying that the Russians will not storm these territories in front, and the sources are saying that currently the Russians are trying to accumulate forces to the south of the village by the name of Konstantinopolska, and the Russians will try to attack in this direction with the purpose to cut Uspenivka from supplying support. And at the same time, the Russians will continue moving from the village of Dalny in the western direction, trying to get as close as possible to this water reservoir. And from this water reservoir, the Russians will try to establish complete control over the roads that goes from Yantarne to the Uspenivka fortified area as well. So now the Russians trying to avoid frontal process stormings. They try to outflank, and we see that at least by the 25th of November, they were pretty successful in the use of these tactics. Also, don't forget about resuming of Russian activity to the north of Kurakhove. Today, according to information we have from the village of Velyka, the Russians managed to improve their positions along the railways, and which means that the Russians are planning to begin outflanking maneuver in the direction of Stary Terny with the purpose to stretch the Ukrainian defense lines and to get as close as possible to the supply lines that goes from the Kurakhove power plant and the village of Dalnya. So this supply road is the final road the Ukrainians still have, and the Russians will try to get as close as possible with the purpose to establish complete artillery and fire control over this territory. So now the main purpose of the Russians is to increase the Ukrainian losses as much as possible. So to make the situation, then after the battle for the South Donetsk, the Ukrainians would be completely defeated without operational reserves, without even tactical and strategical reinforcements and reserves in this direction. We know that Ukrainians suffered the significant problems with the mobilization by the 25th of November. According to information from the open source, the Ukrainians managed to fulfill just 66% of mobilization needs mobilization number they need right now. And then, of course, from the Kurakhove direction, now let's move to the Velyka Novosilka. We have a lot of changes on the ground. Let's take a look at how the map was developing and changing, at least since the 19th of November. This is exactly the date when the Russians began their offensive operation in this direction. During the previous 3-4 days, the Russians were storming and attacking the Ukrainian positions, getting more and more strategical and advantageous positions in the direction of Velyka Novosilka, and by the end of the 25th of November, the Russians were already on the outskirts of the settlement itself. You know that several pro-Russian resources have already published some videos of how the Russian soldiers were moving on some streets, and the author of those videos reported that those were already the streets of Velyka Novosilka. We haven't managed to geolocate them, so this is the reason why we haven't added them on map, but maybe tomorrow somebody will do this, and then we will see the entire picture, and maybe the battle and the clashes on the territory of the town has already begun. Anyway, the situation for the Ukrainians and in this area is very difficult. And during the previous 24 hours, we got lots of videos of how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian forces on the territory of these settlements, and we have no doubts about additional progress during the previous 24 hours. And as for this direction, as we discussed in the previous video, the most important task for the Russians is to attack the gap between the defense belts in the Zaporozhye direction. I'll remind you that, as according to information we have, according to information that we can find in the open source, there is a gap between the, let's say, village of Berezove and the village of Dachny. We're talking about this line, and as you can see, there are not so many strongholds and defense belts of the armored forces of Ukraine, and the Russians considers this territory as the weakest line of the armored forces of Ukraine. And the Russians believes that if they increase their pressure in this direction, they will be able to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt. If the Russians are able to take under control the village of Gavrilovka, then we have no doubts the Russians will turn their offensive in the south-western direction with the purpose to defeat the Ukrainians between the towns and cities like Orekhov and Gulyai-Polskaya. So this is the primary target for the Russians, and you know that today we start receiving updates that most likely France and the United Kingdom will send their troopers on the territory of Ukraine, and this is probably the main reason, and the main reason why they're going to send them, because we see that Ukrainian defense is collapsing, is crumbling. And we see that Ukrainians don't know and don't have any solution how to stabilize the lines. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Selidova direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got an additional batch of videos of how the Russians were FPV droning and attacking the Ukrainian forces along the roads and railways that go between the city of Selidova itself and the city of Pokrovsk. We have a lot of strikes. Now we don't know for sure whether the Russians are planning to turn their offensive in the northern direction right now, but one thing we know for sure, that now the Russians are planning to move in the western direction, and according to information we have during the previous 24 hours, the Russians began an assault operation of the village of Pushkina and the village of Zhovte. So a few more no names villages in this direction, which for the Ukrainians doesn't have any value, because the Ukrainians can't create their positions there. So that's why for them it's better to retreat. And as I understand, there are very interesting configuration of the map. First, I would like to draw some lines. As you can see, there are a lot of villages that are located along this yellow line. So there is like yellow line, and it's like a circle of small villages, Novotroitska, Uspenivka. They lays along one road or along one configuration of lines. It's very difficult to explain what I'm trying to tell you, but I believe you understand me. And there is another, let's say, concentration of villages that are located right in the middle of the first line. This is it. And so, as I understand, the primary target for the Russians, as for now, to force Ukrainians to retreat from this yellow cloud in the direction, let's say, of Novopavlovka. The Russians will try to take under control these villages, and then from this direction, the Russians will decide where to attack next. This is the perfect situation for attack. Of course, from one side, the Russians might appear in some encirclement by the armed forces of Ukraine from many directions, but from another side, in this pocket, the Russians will be able to concentrate the critical mass, and then the Russians will be able to decide where to attack next. The Russians may attack in the north, the Russians may attack in the west, and the Russians may attack in the southern direction. And this will force the Ukrainians to keep the significant number of forces along the entire line, because they will not be able to understand almost by the hour of attack where exactly the Russians will try to attack, and they will have to keep reserves everywhere. So this is I believe, is the trick that the Russians are planning to create in the southwestern Pokrovsk direction. Very interesting operation that we might see probably in a month or in 2 months. Now let's talk about the city of Toretsk. There was a small operational pause in this area, but starting 25th of November, the Russians resumed their offensive, and today the Ukrainian sources published a significant number of FPV drone attacks on the Russian positions in the most western part of the Zabalka district. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. And now officially the Zabalka district was cut in two. The Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt from the most eastern part of the Zabalka district to the most western part of the Zabalka district. We have geolocations along the entire line. We just draw, and we have a lot of geolocations exactly since the beginning of November. A lot of Ukrainian strikes took place exactly in this area, and now the Russians will try to handle with every single Zabalka district separately. And most likely first the Russians will attack the southern part, the southern Zabalka district, and after the Russians finish with the southern Zabalka district, the Russians most likely will try to outflank first of all the Toretsk mine and to attack the central mine itself. So this is probably the plan and the task of the Russians for the December and for the early January of 2025. As for the Chasiv Yar direction, we haven't received anything special from this territory. As for the Sivers direction, we have several important updates. The Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian bridges. You might say that there is nothing special in this area, in these explosions. This bridge was destroyed along Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, right to the north of Orekhovo, Vasilievka, Dubovo, Vasilievka, right to the north of Chasiv Yar, and the second bridge logistic road was destroyed on the territory of Siversk itself, exactly in this point. I'll remind you that this direction was restarted by the Russians. There were reports that the Russian generals were captured in this area due to problems and lie that was sent to the headquarters. A number of sources confirmed the removal of the Colonel General Gennady Anashkin, commander of the South Group of Forces, from the Sivers direction. So this direction was restarted. As I understand, someone new arrived in this area, and after new general arrived in this direction, we start receiving a lot of updates of how the Russians were bombing and destroying the Ukrainian bridges. I'll remind you that several bridges were destroyed between Kryva Luka and Zakitna. Also, the Russians established complete fire control over the main concentration and the temporary deployment points of the armed forces of Ukraine. Another bridge was destroyed in the vicinity of Raigorodok. And today we got report that the Russians destroyed another bridge along Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, and another bridge was destroyed on the territory of Siversk itself. So as you can see, completely different approach, and we see that a new general began doing everything since the beginning. He started destroying logistic, and after logistic, the Russians will have much more better situation, much more better positions, and it will be much faster for them to develop another offensive operation. As for the changes on the ground, we have reports that according to pro-Russian resources, the Russians managed to secure the village of Tarskoye almost completely. Around 80% is already under Russian control, but this information wasn't confirmed neither by any geolocation nor by neutral or pro-Ukrainian mappers. So for now we are going to keep the map as is, but once again we will keep this information in our minds that maybe the village of Tarskoye was already captured by the Russians. As for the north in Kupiansk direction, there are regrouping process. The Russians are concentrating the critical mass, seeking the Ukrainian positions that might be destroyed. So everything is in the preparation state. Most likely soon the Russians will begin offensive. Very important update are coming from the territory between the villages of Dvorichna and Dvorichne. The sources reported, the pro-Ukrainian mappers reported that the Russians managed to cross the river Voskol and to establish strong positions on the Ukrainian side of the river Voskol. We are talking about these forests along the river. The sources are saying that the Russians may try to attack. If they continue this operation successfully, very likely the Russians will try to attack in the direction of Dvorichna itself. From this foothold, the Russians may attack the village of Figolivka, and from these positions, the Russians may try to attack in the direction of Kutkovka. If the Russians are able to develop their positions on this side of the river Voskol, including the town of Dvorichna, this is going to be a perfect situation for the Russians to attack the Kupiansk from the north. This is obviously something that Ukrainians didn't expect, and this can lead to complete defeat and collapse of Ukrainian positions here. And the biggest problem, if the Russians are able to conduct this operation very fast, then they will be able to move further in the western direction towards the water reservoir. This one Pechenegi water reservoir, and if the Russians are able to advance fast in the western direction, then the Ukrainians to the south of Volchansk would be caught in cauldron. So something interesting is going to happen during the next several months exactly in this direction. As for the Sudzha direction, we haven't received anything special, just regular activities. The most important updates are coming from the Kursk, from the city of Kursk, because during the previous night the Ukrainians attacked the territory of the airfield with the ATACMS missiles, and the sources are saying that as a result of ATACMS missiles, the Ukrainians managed to destroy several Russian air defense systems like S-400, which is obviously very not good situation for the Russians. This is the video of ATACMS strikes from the very close view, and once again the Ukraine used the Western weapon once again on the territory of Russian Federation, and now everybody should expect the answer from the Russian side. Maybe the Russians will use the ballistic missile system Oreshnik. Maybe the Russians are going to use something else. Maybe the Russians will attack these countries who provided the Ukrainians this type of weapon. During the next several days, obviously we're gonna know this. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.